I used to have this recurring nightmare, I guess, about going into a restroom and instead of finding a stereotypical American toilet, I'd encounter the kind that required the user to squat above them. It didn't occur to me until I wandered into a nature park restroom in Japan that the style of restroom was common in the areas my family traveled to when I was very young. That's where I'd experienced this style of restroom, and that's where that design left the indelible mark on my developing brain. My restroom nightmare was objectively so silly, and born of unfamiliarity with that particular style of plumbing. I haven't had that dream again. Where my trip to a random park bathroom in Japan cured me of a silly, ignorant fear, Terry Helvey, a sailor, stalked a shipmate into a park bathroom to commit a hate crime, and set off decades of unrelenting nightmares for Allen Schindler's surviving family members. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. In September of 1992, with the USS Bellawood amphibious assault ship underway to Nagasaki, Radioman Petty Officer 3rd Class Allen Schindler, Jr. requested to see the ship's captain. Schindler was ready to bring an end to the harassment he'd endured on board, and asking to see the captain was his next attempt at having his concerns finally addressed. Shipmates had glued his locker shut and referred to him by derogatory slurs. Nevertheless, his concerns were ignored, and his request to speak with the captain denied. Nearly 10 months earlier, Schindler transferred to the Bellawood from the USS Midway. For folks living in or traveling to San Diego, that's the big aircraft carrier that's been turned into a museum. Schindler liked to draw in his free time, collect comic books, and was very fond of animals. He'd been happy while serving aboard the Midway during the Desert Storm campaign. But the Bellawood was an entirely different animal, and he began suffering harassment almost immediately. While the Bellawood transited from San Diego to Sasebo in Nagasaki, Japan, Schindler took action to guarantee a conversation and broadcast an unauthorized message on secure lines to most of the Pacific Fleet. The statement read, 2QT to be STR8. Too cute to be straight. Finally, on September 24th, Schindler met with the ship's XO, the executive officer. With the ship's chaplain present, Schindler formally declared that he was gay and requested a transfer and a discharge. I see a lot of sources describing this as declaring himself as gay, but that term doesn't seem quite right. Given that being gay in the military was illegal in 1992, this wasn't so much a declaration as it was a confession that he would be penalized for. For those who were wondering, homosexual activity had been grounds for discharge from the military since the Revolutionary War, but formal policies based on sexual orientation didn't begin to appear until World War II. When the military added psychiatric screening to induction, it included homosexuality as a disqualifying trait. Gay service members, if discovered, were court-martialed, imprisoned, and dishonorably discharged. But commanding officers found it difficult to convene a court-martial to handle outed service members during times of active war, so they transitioned to what's been labeled blue discharges. A man or woman found to be attracted to their own sex, but who hadn't committed any sexual acts while in service, would usually be categorized as undesirable upon their separation, and those found guilty of engaging in sexual conduct were usually dishonorably discharged. Nearly 20 years before Schindler outed himself formally, Air Force Tech Sergeant Maltovich intentionally outed himself to challenge the ban on non-heterosexual service members. In 1991, the year before Schindler disclosed his sexual orientation, Senator Brock Adams and Representative Barbara Boxer introduced legislation to end the ban completely. When that legislation failed, Adams and Representative Pat Schroeder reintroduced the bill the following year. In 1991, then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney dismissed the idea that gay men posed some kind of security risk when his press aide was himself outed. Being gay obviously does not pose some sort of inherent risk or signal some sort of inherent untrustworthiness. What actually could pose a security risk was putting non-heterosexual service members into hiding, where outing them could be used as leverage. Forcibly outing somebody is leverage where discharging them dishonorably would impact their ability to get and retain a job in the future. Schindler also informed his own commanding officer and the ship's legal officer of his orientation. They told Schindler that it would take weeks to process his discharge, and they declined to transfer him off the ship, despite the harassment he faced. Despite his shipmates telling him that they believed he deserved to die. With Schindler formally out, no one could guarantee that the harassment wouldn't be much worse. The day after his confession, Schindler was summoned to appear at Captain's mast for the radio message. He asked that the hearing be closed, to protect what confidentiality he could. His commanding officer denied the request, and somewhere between 200 and 300 sailors attended and watched as he was reduced from E3 to E1 and placed on 30-day restriction aboard the ship. Although Schindler made no further admissions about his sexuality at the hearing, scuttlebutt doesn't stay contained for very long. When the ship docked in Sasebo, Schindler was still on restriction until the 30 days elapsed on October 23rd. On the evening of Tuesday, October 27th, Schindler left the ship and sometime around 11 p.m. entered a public restroom in Sasebo Park. Two of his shipmates, Airman Apprentice Terry Helvey from the ship's weather department and Airman Apprentice Charles Vins, followed him into the restroom. Vins was ready to testify that they hadn't just happened upon Schindler. Helvey had been stalking him. Once inside, Helvey began punching, choking, and kicking Schindler. When Schindler fell to the ground, Helvey began singing while he stomped Schindler's chest and torso. Finally, Helvey stomped on Schindler's throat, transferring all of his weight to his foot. Schindler's blood filled his mouth and he struggled to breathe. A witness ran to alert shore patrol, who returned within 30 seconds. Vins also disclosed that after beating up and running away from two shore patrolmen, Helvey suggested they clean up and stop at some bars to establish an alibi. Medical clinic staff tried to revive Schindler for 19 minutes before he succumbed to his injuries, and they pronounced him dead. The witness who alerted shore patrol to the beating was stationed on the Bellawood and knew Schindler, but he was unable to identify Schindler's body due to the extent of his injuries. Similarly, when Schindler's family requested to open his coffin following his wake, his mother observed that there was a sailor in dress blues inside, but that it certainly wasn't her boy. His sister could only identify him by the tattoos on his forearms. Schindler suffered at least 4 fatal injuries to his head, chest, and abdomen. The stomps and kicks to Schindler's chest broke 8 ribs, tore his aorta, and filled his pericardial sac with 250 milliliters of blood. The violence turned Schindler's liver to a pulp and ripped his bladder open. Some of Helvey and Vins's kicks were aimed at Schindler's genitals and lacerated and bruised his penis. The stomps and kicks to Schindler's face and head crushed both, rupturing the globes of his eyes, breaking his nose, breaking his upper jaw, and completely detaching the middle portion of his face, leaving the bones floating loosely. His body bore bruises and cuts on the surface of his head, neck, chest, along with bruises on his brain, lungs, and heart. The beating destroyed nearly every organ in Schindler's body and left him with sneaker tread marks on his forehead and chest. Helvey at some point bashed Schindler's head against a urinal so violently that he broke the porcelain. The scene was, in fact, so brutal that the witness who summoned Shore Patrol refused to testify about the scene that he discovered, because Schindler's mother and sister were in the courtroom. The medical examiner, though, couldn't opt out, and explained that the injuries Schindler endured were in line with a low-speed aircraft accident. After beating a man to death, Helvey got a full night's sleep, then rolled up for an interview with a Navy investigator. He told that Navy investigator that he hated homosexuals, that he was disgusted by them, and that he did not regret killing Schindler. He said he would do it again, and that Schindler deserved it. Helvey also shared that he'd always wondered what it would be like to kill a man. For reasons that aren't quite clear to me, it seems the investigator suggested to Helvey that he should express some kind of remorse, so Helvey clarified in his written statement. He wrote that he regretted the incident happened and that he felt it could have been avoided if gay men hadn't been allowed into the military, but also that he found homosexuality disgusting, sick, and scary. At some point during his court-martial, Helvey ever so slightly changed his tune, stating he didn't attack Schindler because he was a gay man. As you can imagine, that seemed pretty unbelievable, because while there is no acceptable reason to attack Schindler in this way, without the motivation of, committing a hate crime, there was no motive for murdering Schindler. The defense tried to paint Helvey as the pleasant person his aunt described him to be. Friends and neighbors offered video testimony that he was just such a nice boy. They introduced pictures of him at prom and newspaper clippings related to his achievements playing basketball in high school. Then, in case that reform campaign didn't work, they tried to blame his actions on a combination of steroid use and alcohol. Helvey blamed his childhood. He asserted his mother took LSD when she was pregnant with him, that his father was a heroin addict that abandoned the family, that his stepfather beat him, amputated half a finger by smashing it in a door, and made Helvey eat his own feces. And it's not clear which, if any, of those claims are true. But Helvey was involved in the child welfare system while growing up. He spent at least a year in a boys' group home. One social worker's report described Helvey as unwilling to accept discipline and reliant on physical violence to settle problems. Another said he had a short temper and settled arguments with fights. One might reasonably wonder why the Navy would allow someone with such a predisposition towards violence to enlist, or how the psychiatric questionnaire that delved into people's sexual orientation could have missed this predilection for violence. In boot camp, Helvey was named the Master at Arms. He said he won everyone over by being the tough guy, by beating up another enlistee. After he did that, he said, people wanted to be his friend. Facing a charge of murder, the death penalty was on the table, and to avoid the death penalty, Helvey accepted a plea agreement and pled guilty to unpremeditated murder. In accordance with that plea, he received a sentence of life in prison. But Helvey didn't walk into that bathroom alone, and Charles Vins also pled guilty for his role. Vins kicked Schindler once in the head and 3 times in the ribs while he was on the floor. In exchange for testifying against Helvey, Vins was permitted to plead to the lesser charges of failing to report a serious crime, concealing an offense, and resisting arrest. Sources vary on some of these numbers, but Vins received between a 4-month and 1-year sentence for which he served a total of 78 or 98 days before receiving a general discharge from the Navy. Reporters from the Chicago Tribune sat down with Helvey at Fort Leavenworth for his first media interview. He was 22 years old, 6'4", and down 20 pounds from his Navy weight of 240. He was, at the time, a self-described bodybuilder. He was proud he hadn't lost any of his muscle when he dropped that weight. Helvey told reporters that prison wasn't so bad, and that he actually had a pretty nice little setup. He specifically appreciated the decent gym, the lack of bills, the lack of taxes, and that he received 3 hot meals a day. Prison, it seems, suited him better than the rumors that spilled out after he killed Schindler. The rumor went around that Helvey and Schindler were in a relationship, and that was what sparked this murderous rage. In response to this rumor, Helvey said that he thought he would die, that people thinking he could be gay was worse than a possible death sentence. Helvey tried to clarify. He didn't like Schindler, and in fact he didn't like any homosexual men. He was, quote, big time against them, a fact that he asserted while grinning. In one of his explanations for his actions that evening, Helvey blamed Schindler for the fight. He said that he and Vins followed Schindler into the bathroom and that even though he enjoyed fighting, he didn't throw the first punch. He claimed Schindler realized there would be a fight when he'd turned and discovered that 2 of his shipmates followed him into the bathroom. Helvey said Schindler started to throw a punch, but that he, Helvey, hated to get hit, so he reacted. But Helvey also offered an alternative explanation for that evening. He said Schindler made a pass at him and exposed himself. When the Chicago Tribune sat down with Helvey, his then-current version of events involved only a light beating, claiming he and Vins left before Schindler was seriously injured. He asserted someone else must have mauled Schindler, perhaps the responding paramedics. Allegedly, Helvey believed he would be charged with manslaughter, receive a 10-year sentence, and be out quickly for his good behavior. He claimed his lawyers showed him a picture of the electric chair in order to manipulate him into accepting a plea agreement. He decided to speak out after the fact, he claims, to show young kids why they shouldn't go into the military. By his logic, he was peeling back the curtain on military justice by sharing his version of events. I don't think we need to take Helvey at his word for, well, basically anything he claimed. When he described his efforts to expose the entire system of military justice, he was frank. He admitted he would manipulate and lie in a second in order to help himself. Even though he said that he would do it again, Helvey said that it was bad luck that Schindler died and that his death made Helvey realize that the life he was leading was wrong. And I do think that Helvey did get lucky often. There were seemingly no consequences for solving issues with violence in the group home. There were no meaningful consequences when he beat someone up in boot camp to establish dominance and make people just fearful enough of him to befriend him. Helvey, it seemed, genuinely believed that his brand of violence resonated with the Navy's policy towards homosexual sailors. This is a man who is talented at blaming the world for the actions that he deliberately chose to take. But it would be ignorant for us to believe that this violence occurred in a vacuum. The command aboard the Bellawood failed Schindler. They failed him by ignoring his reports of bullying and harassment. They failed him by keeping the captain's mast open and by not transferring him off the ship following his disclosure. About 2 years after Schindler's death, the Clinton administration adopted the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Don't Ask, Don't Tell kept it illegal to be attracted to your own gender and to serve in the armed forces. This was actually the closest that Clinton could get to fulfilling a campaign promise to allow all citizens to serve in the military regardless of their sexual orientation. In exchange for maintaining their silence about their sexuality, closeted homosexuals or bisexual service members couldn't be discriminated against or harassed. The logical fallacy, of course, is that if no one confirms their sexuality, it's hard to prove they're being discriminated against because of it. Superiors couldn't initiate an investigation of a service member's orientation without witnessing disallowed behaviors, and service members' sexuality was no longer the subject of in-processing questionnaires. But any evidence of non-heterosexual behavior deemed credible could be used to initiate an investigation. All of this, viewed through the lens of 2024, blows my mind. The Department of Defense functionally used taxpayer funding and investigating officer time to systematically drag people out of the closet. As long as the parties to a relationship are consenting adults, who cares? It would seem easily avoidable for those who were against same-sex relationships for religious reasons. If you don't want to be in a same-sex relationship, you don't have to be. It wasn't until 2011 that the Obama administration ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell and allowed non-heterosexual individuals to openly serve. The Florida Don't Say Gay policy reminded me a lot of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Where Don't Ask, Don't Tell specifically prohibited the non-heterosexual people from disclosing their sexual orientation or from speaking about same-sex relationships, Florida ostensibly prohibited all teachers from discussing their relationships, heterosexual or not. This was part of a sweeping ban on discussing sexual orientation or gender identity up through the 8th grade, unless the instruction was required for lessons on sexual abstinence. Florida did a better job of creating a policy that looked on its face a little bit more neutral. But it's naive to think that straight teachers who mentioned their spouse in Florida, of all places, would be penalized for their supposed indiscretion. Beyond demonizing teachers' personal relationships, the bill set up the potential nightmare scenario of children of a same-sex couple drawing their two dads or two moms in a family portrait and exposing their teacher and school to civil suit from other parents. This is all a problem, as I'm sure you've gathered, because it further ostracizes members of the LGBTQ community, a community that already suffers increased rates of death by suicide. Schindler's death serves as a reminder that making someone's sexual orientation illegal doesn't actually accomplish anything. It just plays into tropes that serve to further divide. I found this case so important to cover for two reasons. First, because this is one of the cases that isn't really motivated by sex or money. It's not like the cases where somebody kills their partner. This was a hate crime directed at a shipmate because of who he was. It embodies the antithesis of what I've observed the military to be. By and large, service members are dedicated to supporting each other in their mission to serve the nation. I admit, though, that I have the benefit of peeking in, decades later, at a force freed from the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in a country that allows same-sex marriages. The second reason I felt this case was important to discuss is because I read a lot of concerning rhetoric and discourse regarding transgender service members on social media pages aimed at young enlisted service members. The conversations are focused on othering transgender service members, claiming disgust or unfitness for service. I don't know how pervasive the attitude is, but Helvey taught us that it only takes one radicalized or hate-fueled young adult to commit a brutal act, and it's a lesson worth remembering. In the wake of Schindler's callous murder, the Navy denied receiving any complaints of harassment. Sailors disclosed their own experiences in light of the Navy's deafening silence, including reporting Helvey and Vince to the ship's legal officer before Schindler's violent death. It wasn't until 2015, following 23 years of seeking answers, that the Navy released a 900-page report confirming that Schindler had reported the harassment prior to his death. More than that, though, the report revealed that Schindler's friends aboard the ship had also reported the harassment, perhaps thinking enough voices would spur the command to take action to protect the young man they were responsible for. Instead, naval investigators targeted those friends for investigations into their sexual orientation. Schindler's family opposes parole each time Helvey has a hearing. In his parole hearings, Helvey asserts that he is a changed man. He lists his good behavior and mentorship of other prisoners as signals that he is ready to rejoin society. When Helvey was up for parole in 2022, the United States Parole Commission received more than 110 emails and 30 phone calls from members of the community expressing their opposition. Following a hearing, one member of the United States Parole Commission recommended that Helvey be approved for parole and released from prison. The other 4 members sitting on the Parole Commission voted to deny parole and retained Helvey in custody to continue serving his life sentence. I believe Helvey was entitled to another parole hearing this year, 2024, though I've had a difficult time tracking anything down on it. From what I gather, Helvey moved to the Federal Correctional Institution in Greenville, Illinois, and the parole hearings for 2024 at Greenville were held in February and July. The Parole Commission didn't enumerate what conditions they believed prevented Helvey's release in 2022. But given the relative silence about his 2024 hearing and the fact that he's still listed as an inmate in Greenville, I presume the condition or conditions still apply. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we take another pass at factual sufficiency. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.